Okay.
Transportation exclusions. So we talked a little bit about the 25143.2 D3 transportation exclusion. That's the one where you can transport hazardous waste between owners at different locations as long as it's recycled at the last location. So here we have an example. So the same owner transfers antifreeze and recycles it at one service station and sends it back to the original shop. What do you think? Would that be okay? Anybody want to vote? Okay, in this example, it's not recycled at the last location because it's being returned to the original generating location. So they would not be eligible for the D3 exclusion. So if the generator could send it to the last location and all of that antifreeze was recycled and used at the last location, then it would be excluded. And it would be eligible to go to that location without a manifest, without being a hazardous, without a registered hauler. So what if the antifreeze was not a hazardous waste in the first place? Less than whatever, 50%, 30%. Then we are not here, right? So always go back to, is it a hazardous waste to begin with? Right? So here we have potentially a D4 exclusion. So the same owner transfers it and recycles it at an offsite TSDF from that last location. So D4 says that if it's managed as hazardous waste and then recycled at an offsite facility, allows consolidation. So here, what do you think? So as long as this last location is sending it to Mary's antifreeze, which is a TSDF, under a manifest, then that would be okay. The possible change in generator status, the language in the statute says that it's deemed to have been generated at the last location. So if I had antifreeze at this location and I sent it to this location without a manifest, without a registered hauler, it's deemed to be generated at this location. So potentially, when you're counting, you may have been potentially a C-squeegee or a small quantity generator here for the waste that you generated here. But now you're adding waste because you're taking waste from your co-locators. So here and it's deemed to have been generated at that last location. So it could bump up your generator status, your counting. So you have to remember that. Any questions on D or 3? D3 or D4? Okay. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the E overrides. No matter what you've been led to believe so far, if you get overridden by anything in E, you don't get the exclusion. So 25143.2E does not allow use constituting disposal. So anything being applied to the land as a fertilizer, agricultural. There is certain agricultural things that are allowed under Chapter 16, and there's certain regulations spelled out as to what those products that are made from recyclable material have to meet. If it's being burned for energy recovery, including commercial chemical products, then any claim to that B or D exclusion would be lost for that potentially recyclable material. If it's accumulated speculatively, so if it's stored for too long. Etchants that are sent off-site without proof that it's being used as an etchant. Used oil, which are not recycled in certain ways. So for the E1, they apply to RCRA waste, and they're used in a manner constituting disposal. E2 are for non-RCRA waste used in a manner constituting disposal. So they're either directly applied to or placed on the ground or indirectly applied to the ground. In other words, it's being used to produce a product which is being eventually placed on the ground, or is contained in products which are applied to the land or to the ground. So if I have a recyclable material, and like Charles was referring to earlier, and I sent it to a company that's going to make resin fence posts or something, and that fence post is going to be put in the ground, and that's its ultimate use, then you lose that exclusion all the way back up front, because its ultimate end use is in a manner constituting disposal. So E3 is burning for energy recovery if the secondary material is burned as a fuel, or it's used to produce a fuel or contained in a fuel. And again, there's possible exemptions for retrograde materials like there is in the E2. E4, again, speculative accumulation. We're going to go over that in a second. E5 is inherently waste-like materials, dioxin-containing materials, F0, 21 through 23, and some other ones. E6 is a spent etchants to another facility. And E7 are used oils burned for energy recovery or used in a manner constituting disposal. So here we have a few slides of things that potentially are used in a manner constituting disposal. So E1 is for RCRA and E2 is for non-RCRA. What do you guys think? In looking at these slides, are these things being used in a manner constituting disposal? Yeah, they're applied to the land, right? So maybe somebody is, wanting to recycle a wastewater. And in the picture on the right, all this wastewater is being used as dust suppressant. Okay, so it's being applied to the land. How about this one? Is it UCD? Is it used in a manner constituting disposal when used in road de-icer? If it's solvent, no. But it's going to be applied to the land, right? And in, Right, it's going to be applied to the land, so probably don't get the exclusion. How about this one? We have cat litter, right, that contains cobalt chloride, which changes color when the material's wet. All right, so when you need to change your litter box, right? As it's turning different colors. Okay, so if I had cobalt chloride, which was recycled and made into a material, which got made into kitty litter and sold as pick of the litter, is it used constituting disposal when used in the kitty litter? What do you think? No? Yes. No. Yes. Right. Yeah, it's ultimate use, right? I mean, when you're done with the kitty litter, where is it going to go, right? In the trash. And where's that trash going to go? Into the landfill, using applied to the land. Supplied to the land. Fertilizer supplied to the land. Good try, though. Thanks for playing. Is what? Awful in the garden? Does it work well? Waste your time. Clump up real hard. I'm going to remember that. How about this one? So, right, he's applying pesticides. But there are certain regulations in 66266.115 which do allow you to make agricultural products which are applied to the land as long as you meet certain very stringent regulations. It has to show not to leach, etc. So there are use constituting disposal regulations in Chapter 16, which is 66266. So here we have stall dry, a barnyard absorbent. So what do you think? Safe for all animals. Is it UCD when used as in a barnyard absorbent? Pretty similar to the cat litter, right? Yeah. How about if it's being used in industrial absorbent? Presumably, we don't necessarily know what's going to happen to the absorbent after, but it's... Exactly, yeah. We'll just presume, we have to presume it's a hazardous waste, yeah. Otherwise, you're right, we wouldn't be here. Right. But that's a very, good question to ask, which not all generators and or Koopas necessarily ask. And some of the things that, Charles, of course, gets asked a lot, and if people can find me, they ask me, what we call back people up. So they'll come to us maybe with a question and say, I think, somebody wants to qualify for a recycling exclusion and they're doing this, can they do that? I don't think they can do that. And the first question we might ask is, well, what is the waste? How is it generated? Is it hazardous? Do we know? Do they know through knowledge or testing? Is it listed? Is it characteristic? Is it RCRA? Is it not RCRA? Because before we can even get here, we got to know all those questions first. So we have to back people up. With waste classification and recycling, it seems like a continuum, right? So you have to know that first, and then with recycling, you have to know what's going to happen at the end to know how it's regulated all in between. Yeah.
And here we're talking about hazardous waste that's used to make the absorbent, not the absorbent after it's been used. Mm-hmm. Although that may be another aspect of it.
So is incineration a type of burning for energy recovery? Yes? On? To, in some manner in which it will provide energy? Or is it just destruction, right? So good question. What if the absorbent goes to a BIF, a boiler industrial furnace? Probably burning for energy recovery. So now we're going to talk about speculative accumulation. So this provision serves to prevent indefinite stockpiling of secondary materials. Again, that term that's defined nowhere. But waste-like materials. So a material is accumulated speculatively if it's accumulated or stored prior to being recycled, if 75% of the material, starting on January 1st, has not been recycled or transferred to be recycled at the end of the calendar year. Again, there's a possible exemption for retrograde materials. So let's look at an example of this and see what we can figure out. So is this a waste by speculative accumulation? A painter generated 200 kilograms of paint chips in March of 2007. He stores them for eventual recycling, ships them off in June of 2008. Was it a waste? Okay. When was it a waste? How much has to be recycled before December 31st of 2007? So let's go, I want me to go back here. So it's accumulated speculatively, right? If it's stored prior to being recycled, if 75% of the material starting on January 1st has not been recycled by the end of the year, calendar year. What do you guys think about? You think 150 kilograms has to be recycled before December 31st, 2007? Yeah? We have 3 yeses and 4 I don't knows. Okay. No, because he's not starting January 1st. Do Do we go back? Okay. So he has to have started on January 1st. Here he started in March of 2007. All right, so we'll go back. Right, so that's where we get to how much has to be recycled by December 31st of 2008. By 2008, 75% has to be recycled. So really, if the generator times it right, he's going to get almost 2 years. Okay, you have to know when they started accumulating to determine when to start determining how much they have to recycle. Am I getting this wrong?
No, you're right. The key point, the key point is here. If 75% of the material type commencing on January 1st has not been recycled. Okay. So for the first year, okay, he generated this material in March. So to make your speculative accumulation calculation, you say, as of January 1st, 2007, how much material was on site by type? 0. So 75% of 0 is 0. So for 2007, December 31st, he had to recycle 0%. Okay. Then for the following year, on January 1st, how much material did he have on site? 200. So for that calculation for that year, he has to recycle 150 kilograms. So it's the key here, and this really doesn't say it, but the key here is the calculation starts on the beginning of the calendar year. Okay.
Whatever's in inventory at that time.
Right. Whatever.
Got rid of 50 of it then on
Right.
January 1st,
Yeah. So in this example, he gets rid of it in June, so he's automatically met that 150 requirement by shipping it off in June.
So some of the E5 inherently, we misspelled it. Inherently waste-like materials are dioxin precursor materials. And the definition is in 66261.2E. Again, those are the F-listed F0, 20 through 23, 26 through 28, and other secondary materials fed into a halogen acid furnace. We spelled exclusion wrong, too. And these don't get an exclusion. Okay. And E6 provisions are etchants and plating solutions sent off-site, and the long version is in your handout, so you can read what those particularly apply to. Those are on page 6 and 7. And generally no exclusion if you're sending etchants sent off-site. And there's some statutory language in 25.120.55. E7 is for used oil. It limits the exclusion to only some used oils, and it's limited to refineries and reuse on site. And it has its own prohibitions in E7. B. So the requirements for point 9 and 10 for the excluded recyclable materials, we went over this a little bit before. We'll do it again, is an excluded recyclable material must be labeled as an ERM or used oil. You have to have a business plan, an emergency plan. You have to store it in accordance with local rules, fire department rules, or other local rules, and has to have secondary containment to either local or interim status document 264 provisions. Is that right? 25.143.10 applies to both the B and D exclusions and the C permit exemption. And you have to document that a market exists for the recyclable material, that the toxics in the recyclable material are used, there's no toxics along for the ride, and you have to document to the generator. We'll talk a little bit about sham recycling. This is in 66261.2G and in statute in 25143.2F. And they have to have appropriate documentation to show the materials qualify for the exclusion or exemption. And those might exist in the form of contracts with the person who's going to be recycling the material, that there's a known market disposition for those recycled materials, that the ingredients in the recyclable material are equivalent to a raw material, and that they have the necessary equipment to recycle the material. So there are some federal guidance language that talks about sham recycling, of what constitutes sham and beneficial use, and that can be found in the January 4th, 1985 Federal Register, and also in an EPA letter online, RCRA online, from Sylvia Laurence. And there's also some other past interpretive letters on RCRA online, and also in, I'm not sure if you guys have seen the RCRA Orientation Manual. The RCRA Orientation Manual talks a bit about sham recycling. It's a really good baseline document for all things RCRA. And then also in 40 CFR, in 261.2, or in any of the provisions, there's the federal registers that talk about how the regulation was made, and those federal registers are found at the base of every regulation, so you can go back and figure out why EPA determined to make that regulation. So for sham recycling, it has to contain consistent active quantities, just like a new ingredient would have. So the ingredient has to be used in equivalent amounts. It has to have the same effectiveness. It has to be managed as if it were a commodity. Okay, so you're not going to spill it. You're not going to manage it haphazardly, because you're managing as if it was a raw material and has value. So if there's evidence that something's being mismanaged, then that could be an indicator of sham. So if your waste stream is being recycled and it contains unnecessary ingredients or contaminants, or you're using it in more quantities than is really needed, then this is what could constitute what we call toxics along for the ride. And the mobility of the contaminants, if they're released from the ingredient that's being made. So this is kind of the end of our 25143.2 statute. And next we're going to go into all the other different kinds of recyclable materials, or I should say other things like scrap metal and used oil filters and fuel filters and textiles and things in the other part of that flow chart. And are there any things in particular that people want to talk about in depth, or should we go through them all?
I'm going to skip refrigerants because Diana already talked about them. And we'll go to so lead acid batteries, garage exemptions. Okay, all right. How do I say this? Most of the morning, or most of this afternoon, I should say, we've been talking about excluded recyclable materials that are excluded from regulation as hazardous waste when recycled. Okay, there's a whole category of recyclable materials which are hazardous wastes and are subject to regulation when recycled. Okay, for a lot of these materials, recyclable materials, the law and the regulations spell out exemptions from regulation. Okay, these things are still regulated, but they're regulated differently or less than ordinary hazardous waste. So they're regulated at some level. They're not totally excluded. And so an example here is lead acid batteries. In Chapter 16 in 66266.80, there's regulations for lead acid batteries. All right. Basically, people can collect spent lead acid batteries and transport them to recycling facilities, and they're subject to minimal requirements. All right. As long as they are a automotive type lead acid battery, they should qualify for the exemption. But the law uses a term automotive cranking or automotive starting battery or something to that effect. So batteries like forklift batteries or locomotive batteries that are propulsion batteries, but not cranking batteries, those probably shouldn't qualify for the exemption, all right? And then for the handlers of these batteries, if they have more than a ton of batteries stored at any one time, they're only allowed to keep them for 180 days. If they have less than a ton of batteries, they're allowed to store them for up to a year. There's some basic requirements that they store the batteries in a way that they don't leak and they're not broken. And in the regulations that implement this, there's a requirement for annual reports to DTSC, but we don't require anyone to submit those annual reports anymore. No. So this, again, a hybrid vehicle battery would be a propulsion battery. They would also, for the most part, not be lead acid batteries. Okay. Yeah, so there'd be two ways I would say that would not qualify for this exemption. They're not lead acid batteries. So in hybrids right now, you've got what? You got nickel metal hydride, lithium hydride. What's lithium ion? That's the other one. There's a couple out there that are being used. We don't have yet really a special set of regulation for these batteries, but I suspect that's coming pretty soon. All right, shop towels or rags or reusable soil textiles. There's a statute in Health and Safety Code 25144.6 for rags that are hazardous. And basically, it's not a very good statute when you break it down. The problem with the statute is it exempts certain transportation requirements and it exempts certain handling permitting requirements, but it doesn't go further and exempt certain generator requirements and other facility requirements in the text, and it never says the rags are non-hazardous or excluded or anything. So you wind up wondering, what is a person handling these rags really subject to, okay? On the deck plate level, at the practical level, these rags are unregulated at current, okay? That's all I'm going to say. The rag exemption basically allows rags to be packaged up, sent to a commercial laundry, allows the laundry to process the rags without a permit, okay, thereby creating new rags that are recycled and reused, and then all of that happens pretty much unregulated. If the laundry generates hazardous waste in the process of processing the rags, then they would be a generator. Okay. To qualify for the exemption, the rags have to be cloth or textile. Doesn't apply to paper wipes. Like I said, the laundry facilities get a permit exemption, and that's about it. EPA is working on a paper wipe rule. Who knows if we'll ever adopt that rule, but let's see what it looks like. So no paper. Scrap metal, here we go. So scrap metal is a provision. It's not actually in Chapter 16. It's only in Chapter 11. It's basically an exemption from regulation for metal items that are metal. Okay. I can't even put the word recycled on there, but most of us associate scrap metal with scrap metal recycling in the common sense of the term. So what is scrap metal? All right. I have pictures here. I don't know what this stuff is. How about these guys? Are these things scrap metal? What? No? They're not hazardous waste. Someone's taken this class before, I think. All right, so...
Well, let's assume they were going to be thrown away.
So let's assume the chrome bumper would be hazardous for chromium and the copper penny would be hazardous for copper for a moment. Would these things be scrap metal in that case?
Let's assume.
Okay, if they were hazardous, then they could possibly qualify for the exemption for scrap metal when recycled. But as someone pointed out here, this copper penny is whatever a penny's made out of these days, aluminum plated with copper. That copper on the outside is elemental copper from the plating process. It's elemental metal. So if you tested this thing, the TTLC and STLC limits for copper would not apply because the copper is in an elemental state and it's not finely divided, not friable, or not fine powder. The same reasoning and thinking would happen for the chrome bumper. So actually, these are non-hazardous, even if they're being disposed.